Suso, Phizer, the artist behind our current show, Pretend Ones, which hopefully you got a chance to listen to and explore before this, or maybe you were out last night too for the opening. But as you know, we are a nonprofit arts residency and gallery. We are lucky enough to work with a lot of contemporary artists. Right now we have Eric Burtis, Stephanie Cantor. Stephanie's show will be in March, and Eric's in April, so look out for that. And Reese is over here too, from our board, the VP. So yeah, my pleasure to introduce you, Suso. You are originally from St. Louis, currently based in Philly. You know, we have a couple Philly people here. It's really nice. How many? Raise your hand. Whoa. It's like half the room. Wonderful. Cool. Where you are doing your MFA and you're a candidate? First year? First year. Cool. Tyler. Nice. Yeah, and she was in residence with us over the summer 2017, and that's where you began this work that is in the installation today and throughout the month. So yeah. Great. So yeah, we just do this as like a conversational questionnaire, so feel free to join the conversation.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
My experience at a lot of Q&As is that there's this thing where like the artist is the expert of their work and everybody else is sort of like asking questions of the expert, or like even like there's a fan dynamic where it's like not cool to be critical, but I hope that we can invite everyone to feel like experts of the experience, and that I don't feel like I have a special expertise about what the work is about and how it feels to be in there, and also that I'm very open to criticism in this context.
Wonderful. Yeah, so tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice.
So I spent most of my life in St. Louis, and my practice has changed quite a bit. I started out as a painter, and when I went to school for art because I loved painting and I thought I'd be a designer, and then I went to a really good study abroad program that sort of opened my eyes to contemporary art questions for the first time, which I to this day find kind of terrifying that I didn't know anything really meaningful about contemporary art until well into college, at which point I sort of radically changed direction in the way I thought about my work and became much more committed to being an artist as opposed to just wanting to sort of enjoy form in whatever way. And after school I moved to New York and I spent the last 4 years there. I feel like I learned so much from the work that I saw there, and getting also to see firsthand what artist practices are like whose work I liked, which kind of again flipped my perspective, because a lot of the time the work I was most sort of drawn to ended up being some of the most repulsive practices. So that changed my thinking, and now I moved to Philly.
Yeah, but you've only been there for what?
4 months.
Nice.
Yeah. I know that doesn't fully answer your question. I'm just not sure.
Oh yeah, there's a start.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Both starts.
Is this sort of installation typical of the work you've been doing over the past year?
Yeah. So last year I did a project that's kind of quite similar in form to this one, called Phizer, where I started it out by interviewing strangers from Craigslist. And one thing about this show that I didn't end up writing in the text or anything that I think it would be nice to share is that all the interviews that were held were paid interviews. So for the Phizer show is the same. I paid people for that one $10 for talking to me for an hour about their faces, and they just answered a pretty generic Craigslist ad. For this one I paid people $15 to talk to me about, in the ad it said gender and the body, and that project culminated in a series of audio interviews where it was different than this one, because in this one, some people may or may not have noticed this, but the stories are interspersed. So a single story is not very legible, whereas in the Faceware show it was much more about like the narrative of a single person like dealing with the reality of the face they have. So for the past, I would say for the past year and a half, this is kind of where my work has been.
Okay. So was Faceware your first like audio interview project?
Yeah, I guess like relationships and conversation has been a part of my work for a long time, but this is the first time I'm sort of like focusing on conversations with strangers about like their subjective experience.
Yeah. Yeah, you were finishing Faceware, I think, whenever I met you and we did an interview, so yeah, that definitely attracted to me that you were going out into this really like ubiquitous sort of platform like Craigslist and mining information that was very intimate, and that there was a possible exchange in that kind of awkward space.
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, the work began with the post again for the show, and from there, take us a little bit through the production and the steps.
So the work began actually with this more generic ad where I was like asking people, so I was really interested in the face project and I wanted to see like how I can push that farther, because it wasn't really about faces in the same way for me. This isn't really about genitals, but it was just about like using this form as a way to talk about like things we don't talk about that affect every aspect of our like what people expect of us and what we expect of other people and what we expect people to expect of us. So I wanted to see, I thought face was arbitrary, like what if you just choose a random body part? And then what happened was I was having like really uninteresting conversations about people's elbows and stuff. And the form I was doing that in was, I was like choosing from a random list, and then one of the things on the list was genitals, and I found myself just like adding, I pretended it was random, but I was like, would you be open to talking about your genitals? And nobody was, and then I just thought that that was really interesting. And I thought that maybe there was something there, and then I tried a different ad with just about genitals, and the conversations I was having were like, felt very complicated and interesting to me. So that's how it started.
Okay. So were you audio recording those?
Yes.
Like all of them?
Yeah, it was all through Google Voice.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's very easy just to record the call.
Yeah. And then were they transcribed? I know you did a lot of kind of directing and editing when it comes to what ends up in the installation.
Right, so for this final work, I ended up transcribing all of the interviews that I did with people about like gender, sexuality, and their body. It's kind of the subject. And then I did some like several stages of editing where I just took like highlighting most interesting like weird moments, interesting moments, controversial moments, and sort of like starting to group them. And for me, almost immediately, maybe like even in the first interview, it became clear that this project was, for me, not really about a single story, but more about like the intersections of multiple stories. So I was taking like these quotes and seeing what they do when they're butted up against each other. So in the end, I have like 15 transcripts and a lot of rearranging of like blocks of thoughts from different ones. And then after that, once I've settled on like the monologue, does that make sense? It's like scripts, all these transcripts, and then like take from the transcripts and create the monologue. So there ended up being 4 monologues. And once I settled on the monologue, I went back into the original recordings and I created like a model of the original people saying those lines.
So I'm sorry, 4 monologues that came from different interviews?
Yeah, so there were 15 interviews and then there were 4 monologues that I took from all 15 of the interviews. And once I settled on the monologue, I would go back into the original audio and create like a collage of the audio so that you could hear the way the original speaker said the line. Because for me, some of the lines are like just, I don't know. But so it was more about the way they said it than like the words. So then the actor, so there are 4 actors in the space as distinct from the like interview participants. actor listens to the original speakers and attempts to mimic the way that they said the line. Not their voices, like not changing their pitch or affect or accent, but just the tone and emotion behind the line.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I feel like the monologues they're very much a collage of like your experience eliciting this information.
Yeah.
And then like the recasting process, as I understand it, is sort of like this kind of way to like blend and solidify it into an object. An object is a soundtrack, which then we see physically in the space, which has its own terrain that we have to kind of buy into, and put ourselves like physically in that mental space.
Yeah. I like that interpretation. I mean, I think, should I respond? Yeah, I think what you're saying, I don't know if I would have said this independently, but what you're saying is just making me think like, yeah, I think part of the appeal of doing that process is to fictionalize it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, as opposed to just encountering a document, like maybe you feel like this is something that's been created for you and that you're meant to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense, like when you go in there, ideally you feel like you're grappling with something that may or may not be real or true to some original speaker, and whatever feelings are coming up for you intersect with like whatever suspicion or like questions you have about like fiction, nonfiction, object, subject. Like, I know that's pretty abstract, but
Yeah.
that's sort of what
Yeah, I think my comment there was just starting to kind of put together, from past conversations we had during the install and stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what about sort of your daily life and like how do you feel like your work is very much bled into your day-to-day experiences and your observations, or do you feel like you kind of step into the universe of your work? It's either or, really.
Trying to think if there's not an obvious way to answer that question. I think like, of course, the work is directly derived from my like curiosities in my normal life. I think, okay, so this is slightly different than what you asked, but I think that this work comes from like something I would like to happen in my life that the work gives me an excuse to make happen. So it is sort of entering into a different world, but it's like, it's related to the whole Suso Phizer thing. It's like, like my name is Netta. If I work for Suso Phizer, I'm allowed to call strangers and ask them about their genitals and pay them, and I get to hear these stories, and I get to like do this work, even though as Netta I feel weird about it.
Yeah.
And I probably wouldn't make that happen if I wasn't calling it art. I don't know. So that's kind of the intersection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's like different parameters and behaviors that you're encouraging yourself to engage with.
Yeah.
As your artistic pseudonym.
Yeah, it's like the art life divide thing is probably like, in life I wouldn't take as many social risks or ethical risks as I would in art making.
Yeah.
But I do think it's an extension of the same thing.
I like the term ethical risks. I think it's something to chew on for me.
Can I
Oh yeah, please do.
at what point in your interaction with the original interviewees did you sort of say this is for an art project? Was sort of that masked? Was that very much up front?
That was not masked because it was in the Craigslist ad, and actually with the face project, it was masked. And with this one, I felt like I needed as much credibility as possible, so I linked to my website and sort of like explained my work a little bit in the ad to try to give people who would otherwise feel like, oh, this is creepy, like a certain amount of, I don't know, trust.
Was that a reaction to something that happened with the Face project? Like a trust that felt broken or not established?
No, that was more my projection of expectations around talking about genitals and around what people think about Craigslist. Like, I didn't want to be some random creep that wanted to like talk to people about their genitals. Like, I wanted maybe somebody who otherwise wouldn't answer the ad to think like, okay, maybe this is interesting for other reasons besides some like easy way to make money. But no, actually the face project, it wasn't a problem to cloak the art aspect.
Does anyone have any like observations or questions that they want to put into the pool?
We talked briefly last night about the mattresses on the floor, and my thought is kind of immediately when you describe doing art as Suso Phizer gives you the ability to create things and experience things that you wouldn't otherwise. And I know for me, mattresses on a floor for the entire space of a room has always been kind of a fantasy. And so it's cool to be able to see it and experience it in this way. And it's and the unevenness of it leaves a certain I don't know, a certain quality. So I wonder how that relates to the narratives that we're hearing. Why the mattresses? How do you think that they function?
Yeah, so briefly, the mattresses sort of arrived as like one of many solutions for this problem I was seeing with this work, where to me, like, the monologues become a bit casually fun to listen to as a voyeur, and I was trying to find ways to make people more aware of their bodies in the space while listening. So the mattresses have these like seesaws of wood under them, so that sometimes what's going on under your feet will be unpredictable and will change. And sometimes it's not just from your movement, it's from somebody else's movement. And I played with many solutions for how to create this like instability and body awareness. And I ended up going with this one in part because I like that just as a floor it becomes automatic and part of the space, as opposed to like me creating an object that you're engaging with as something separate from the space. It's true that there's something about like the comfort too of walking on mattresses, and there's something about like the reference to used mattresses, like other people's bedrooms. But one thing that happened during the show that I didn't anticipate, or that hadn't happened in my previous stagings of the work, is that everybody sort of sat down and was sort of down low and sort of in these groupings of like sometimes known or unknown people. And I can't really speak to that because I actually didn't have that experience with the work, and I am curious if anybody has a thought as to like how that affected or how that related to the work.
I sat when I went in there after pretty quickly. I mean, I like sitting in general. I'm pretty quick to sit on the floor and watch TV. But I think you're getting, it's a comfortable space. It's fun. You can interact with it in any number of ways. I think the instability of the floor kind of diminishes when you're sitting too.
Right.
And then you can sit under the speakers and get a more direct channel tone. I think that's my experience with it.
It creates much more intimate atmosphere when like you're half sitting, half flying around there and listening and all that. Which I think is fitting the theme very nicely. Definitely for me it was easier to listen to because the sound goes down. So
I have to admit that having attended your previous exhibit in New York where we were standing and listening to stuff, this is a totally different experience from how our body was interacting with what you present. And I was sitting in the first one, was semi lying down the second one, was completely lying down the third one. The experience has changed, and I think there's something in the intimacy that is created by the content and the way you perceive the content with your physical state of your body, which make a big difference.
What do you think it does to the content? What changes?
I think at least for me, you're much more into the stories as opposed to just an observer. You become part of it by your body, the state of your body when you're listening, because of the sensitivity of the topic.
and also having the little strangers kind of laying there next to you this experience normally.